Fantastic. So here we are. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And a particularly warm welcome to Shaun Chamberlin. We're really excited for this conversation. I've been listening to you and kind of watching from afar for several years, Shaun, and more recently got to know you a bit better through your couple of the courses that I'm doing with Stirling College, including Surviving the Future, a deeper dive, which I'm really thoroughly enjoying. So welcome, Shaun.
Thanks, Kim. It's a real pleasure to be here and get to know your little gang.
Fantastic. So perhaps we could start. You run your website is called Dark Optimism, and I know that that's a phrase that's often misunderstood by people when they first hear it. I'm just putting the website address in the chat now. So Shaun, could you tell us a bit about what you mean by dark optimism?
Sure. Yeah, I suppose it kind of stems from being a bit fed up of kind of bright, shiny optimism, you know, like the whole, everything's fine, don't worry about it kind of optimism. And you're like, well, it's not though, is it? You know, and it kind of always, you know, stuck in the core a bit. But at the same time, you know, I sometimes say it's about being unashamedly realistic about the kind of world we're in, but unashamedly positive about the kind of world we could be creating. And I think, yeah, it's about kind of realizing that no matter how much darkness there is in the world around us, and there's plenty, there's nothing about these times that stops us from telling a story we're proud to tell with our days. And ultimately, that's all anyone's ever been able to ask from life. You know, I mean, even going to a famous book by Viktor Frankl about living in a concentration camp and even finding meaning and purpose in days there. I mean, you know, on the one hand, my friend Nate Hagen sometimes talks about walking the narrow path between kind of despair and doom and kind of wild, often kind of green techno optimism. And I just think, well, if someone in a concentration camp can find meaning and purpose in their days, then honestly, I don't feel I have much right to fall into just despair and bleakness. You know, it's just inappropriate to the kind of situation we find ourselves in. On the other hand, you know, the kind of optimism that's like everything's going to be fine, so we don't need to do anything about it, or tell any beautiful tales with our lives, seems to me to miss the point as well. So I guess dark optimism is about that. Yeah, that point of acknowledging the reality of things, which I think it's fair to say is quite dark at this moment in history, but doing it with a kind of undaunted determination to make things better than they would otherwise be.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. And I know that one of the things you're most proud of in your life is continuing the work of collaborating with the late, great David Fleming, and the wonderful book that you created after his death, I think, or published after his death, Lean Logic, which I've certainly found a fantastic treasure trove of a resource. Can you say a bit about that and that kind of legacy, and just a short introduction maybe to David Fleming for those that don't know him?
Sure. So David was, well, firstly, he was an incredible friend and mentor to me. I met him back at the end of 2006 when he taught me at Schumacher College down in Devon in England here. And he was one of the, not founders of the Green Party in this country, or the Ecology Party as it originally was, or even the People Party before that, but he and Jonathan Porritt together were kind of very close friends who kind of took the Green Party and brought it into some kind of national relevance in England and Wales. And by training, he was a historian. But what he found was, with his kind of background in cultural history and his great interest in the ecological issues very broadly, what kept happening was he'd speak to people and they'd say, oh, well, the economists say that's not realistic. You know, we can't realistically, you know, transform the direction of the economy. And Jonathan Porritt tells me that back at the very early Ecology Party conferences, David was there kind of urging people to learn the language of economics so that we could meet these arguments on their own ground and prove them wrong. And true to his word, he went and got himself a PhD in economics. And I think it's quite unusual that someone kind of steps into a discipline in that way without sort of absorbing some of the kind of primary assumptions of that discipline. But for him, it was very much, he was going in to kind of challenge some of the fundamental premises. He sometimes said to me, economics is like this great inverted pyramid, that there's just this incredible edifice of brilliant mathematics and modeling and insight. And it wouldn't be so dangerous if it weren't so brilliant. The problem is that it's teetering on this tiny point of these completely insane assumptions. And so you've got this whole brilliant edifice built on the wrong assumptions. And so it can look really daunting and impressive when you encounter it and when you see all the graphs and all these very highly respected economists coming out and explaining how there's nothing to worry about because we'll just, invent our way out of any limits to growth, etc. But yeah, so David, through this kind of bringing together of history and economics, was involved in, he was a chair of the Soil Association. He helped create a thing called the Other Economics Summit that was a kind of challenge to, I think it was the G7 at the time, which then led to the New Economics Foundation, which now does a lot of great work. And he was one of the great inspirations behind the Transition Towns movement. My friend Rob Hopkins, who was the kind of founder of Transition Towns, often says that, very humbly I might add, he often says that all he did was take Richard Heinberg on kind of energy depletion, David Holmgren on permaculture, and David Fleming on community and resilience, roll the three together and make it comprehensible, and transition fell out, which I think underplays Rob's own role somewhat, but nonetheless gives a sense of where David's coming from. And I think as you mentioned, so he died in 2010 very suddenly, without getting his kind of life's work, this book, Lean Logic, A Dictionary for the Future and How to Survive It, published. And it was only after his death that I found the manuscript, basically, and read it, and was just blown away by this work that's, it's very unusual in many ways. It's sort of structured a bit like Wikipedia. So, each entry, wherever there's a word that has its own entry, there'll be a star next to it. So you can kind of choose your own pathway through the book, depending on your personal interest. And when I first talked to publishers about it, they were like, wow, this is incredible, but it's in this strange format and it's really big. And so I edited out from that this paperback, Surviving the Future, which basically chooses one of the pathways through that dictionary and turns it into a conventional read it front to back paperback. The subtitle, so it's Surviving the Future, Culture, Carnival and Capital in the Aftermath of the Market Economy. And that's, I think, there's a lot I could say about this book, really, and that's why I'm teaching an 8-week course based around it. But I think the essence of it would be two things. Like, firstly, even back in the 80s, David, he'd been campaigning, working within kind of politics with his Green Party work. But even back in the 80s, he was like, we're not going to win this argument. There isn't going to be a great cultural turning to sanity. There should be. There's all kinds of excellent arguments as to why we should go that way. But, you read all these books about, Plan B 3.0 and whatever that are all like, hey, everyone, we really, 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 really need to change direction now. And they all, for me at least, are a bit hollow, because you read them and you're like, well, yeah, I agree, but how do we turn the supertanker, Yeah. And as I say, even sort of 40 years ago, David was like, well, actually, we're not going to. There's too much cultural momentum. There's too much economic momentum. There's too much political momentum tied up in the story, essentially, of economic growth and everything that comes up with that.
Yeah.
And so really his starting point was where most other books end. His starting point was, okay, if we don't change direction, where are we going to end up? And so his starting point really was collapse. And then that led to kind of two themes, which are firstly, what does it make sense to do now in advance of that in the places that aren't yet facing collapse? And secondly, what might life look like after it? Because it's you know, the end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world.
No.
And so to massively boil down like a huge work, I would say the two things that he advocates focusing on are defending and restoring the natural world, the ecology, because that's what all wealth is ultimately based in, and defending and restoring what he calls the informal economy, like ways of relating to each other that are not based in money, community and culture and conviviality and fun and family and love. Like this is what life's really about. Music, the arts, you know, this is really, you know, economics should be just the kind of backdrop where we, you know, provide ourselves with a nice safe place to live and food and water, and then we get on with actually having a culture. But unfortunately, as he said in one interview, the needle hiss has kind of taken over now. You know, it should just be the kind of backdrop there, but it's now all that we ever talk about because our economics has gone so wildly wrong.
Yes, I was interested to read in the February this year IPCC report. It's the first time I've seen it in one of those reports, but again, as you said, it sounded fairly hollow, but they said, here's the quote: "A climate resilient, sustainable world involves fundamental changes to how society functions, including changes to underlying values, worldviews, ideologies, social structures, political and economic systems, and power relationships." I don't suppose anybody will take any notice of that, but it was interesting. It was the first time I'd heard them kind of come out and say that.
Well, no, back in 2018, the IPCC called for, quote, rapid and far-reaching, unprecedented transformation in the economy. So, you know, they don't really want to be saying that. You know, I mean, I was talking to a climate scientist one time who said, you know, when I got into this field, it was this obscure corner of chemistry, essentially. You know, it wasn't like this huge political football that was going to, you know, transform everything. He was just very interested in atmospheric chemistry. And then, you know, here they are finding themselves thrust as the central players in this, you know, global reckoning. It's a strange lot that climate scientists have today. Yes.
So I've shared this with you before, this little slide. We call it the 4 columns. And I think from what you've said already, I mean, our community group is kind of firmly sat in column 4, what we'd call collapse aware. So I guess that's where you are. I guess that's where you are too. Mm-hmm. Whilst remaining, as you said, unashamedly optimistic about what we could do if we got our act together. So,
well, not only what we could do collectively if we get our act together, but what we can do as people and as communities. You know, I think one of the key problems in what people advocate is, you know, the two things we're always told to do are like lobby our political representatives and personal lifestyle change. And honestly, they're both really depressing because, you know, you lobby your political representatives and you get ignored and you think, oh, that was great. Maybe you transform your life utterly to something incredibly. I mean, my friend Mark, who lives 50 yards behind me here, has given up electricity. He's not just off grid, but he was like, well, nobody's explained to me how you can make a solar power panel without industrial civilization. Nobody's explained to me how you can make industrial civilization without destroying the natural world. So I want no part of it. And I'm all for living simply. Like, it's a beautiful thing, and it is often about living a life that's in accordance with your beliefs. But equally, it's depressing because you know full well the whole world's plowing in the opposite direction and killing everything. And you know, they used to say in the 60s and 70s, you know, it's amazing, there's this whole machine, but you can just drop out and it plows on and doesn't even notice you. And that was to some extent true then, but now the machine has got so big, it's, you know, destroying stability of our climate. There's nowhere really to hide anymore. But the thing about those two things that are advocated, you know, lobbying political representatives, personal lifestyle change, the problem with both of them, I think, is scale. Like, lobbying your political representatives is trying to act at a scale that's too big for your voice to be heard. Personal lifestyle change is operating at a scale that's too small to feel like it's making any meaningful difference. And in between those is what we often call the human scale, like the community scale, the scale that I think you guys operate on. You know, it's where you get together at a scale which is small enough that your voice is significant and your actions are significant and you can shape things, but large enough that you can see meaningful consequences, that you can affect the lives of people around you. And I think that's really one of the core focuses of David's work. And the quote of his that's most changed my life is large scale problems do not require large scale solutions. They require small scale solutions within large scale frameworks. And that's been transformative for me. And ever since, like, kind of hearing and integrating that, all of my work has been about those frameworks. So Transition Towns, it's a framework for a whole diversity of local solutions that don't look like each other, but they can support each other and network and build into this kind of wave of change. The courses that I run are, you know, a framework for all kinds of diverse people to explore and learn and gain more empowerment in what they do. The Ecological Land Cooperative that I used to chair is a large-scale framework to support people in getting onto the land and in a way that's affordable and that gets through the planning system. And that is such a key principle, I think. David used to call it the system scale rule. You know, that if you try and go straight to the large scale, you'll get lost, and if you stick at the small scale, you'll get drowned out. But there's some real power to be had.
Yeah. I just had a kind of, I suppose, a semi-technical question before we go on to talk more about feeling fully alive and walking that narrow path. And it's about renewables, because so many people, even in the transition movement, I kind of seem to be banking on that. And I just wondered what your take was. You know, when the fundamental problem is overshoot rather than necessarily even emissions.
Well, I sometimes say, let's imagine that we discovered miraculously some infinite clean energy source. You know, cold fusion suddenly became possible in a teacup due to some incredible work of science or mysticism, or you know, we suddenly discovered this, I don't know, infinite reserve of clean oil bubbling up somewhere, you know, whatever. Imagine what happens if you plug that into our civilization. Like, does it suddenly look like this thing of beautiful justice and sustainability and hope? No, it just grows faster, destroys habitats more quickly, like continues to devour everything in support of human existence. And incidentally, you know, in support of a human economy where, I mean, it's a little glib and oversimplistic, but I sometimes say, you know, half the world's hungry and half the world's depressed, and we're destroying the future in order to sustain this system a little bit longer. So, you know, it's clear that our fundamental problem is not one of energy sources. And it's also clear that the big green NGOs have chosen that narrative. You know, what we need to do is get off fossil fuels and onto renewables, and, you know, then we'll be, I don't even know where they think we'll be, but that's the whole focus. You know, that'll solve climate change and everything will be perfect. There's a lot of holes in that narrative. I mean, not least that in a growth-based economy, you know, if you look at the amount of renewable energy that's coming on stream, which is a great thing, you know, if we're going to get energy from somewhere, far better to get it from renewables and fossil fuels. But at the moment, that's not actually replacing fossil fuels. No, it's just being added to fossil fuels. And so we are consuming more and more and more. And for all the talk, I mean, even just focused on climate change, for all the talk of decoupling emissions from economic growth, I would argue very strongly that the theory says that that's impossible, but in the practice equally clearly says that that's impossible. We're not managing to do that. The tight coupling between the growth in economies and the growth in emissions is startling when you just, you know, plot it on a graph. And so it's very, very clear that if we're going to, well, have any kind of decent future, we need to face up to this fundamental issue of growth. I mean, essentially, we're in this incredibly hard dilemma. Like, I sometimes also get frustrated with degrowth advocates who paint it as this really wonderful, easy thing where, you know, we're all just going to have to work a bit less hard and, you know, consume a bit less and everything will be wonderful and we'll move into this degrowth utopia. You know, I think that we're in a we're in a situation where either we end growth, which means the collapse of our economic systems, and there's no way that's intrinsically desirable, but we either stop growing and collapse our economy, or we keep growing and collapse our ecology. That's the very unfortunate bind that we've put ourselves in collectively. And David has a very insightful entry on growth in his dictionary for the future and how to survive it. And he says there that it's very easy for those of us who've spent our entire lives living through a period of economic growth to not appreciate how much that's brought us, to not appreciate how incredibly difficult it will be to move away from that time. He quotes, I think it's ancient Roman source who said, war is sweet to those who know it not. And moving beyond the period of economic growth is not something we should be intrinsically singing hosannas about, but the alternative is a lot worse.
Yes.
So the point is that economic growth will end. Like this, we treat sustainability as though it's this kind of bolt-on thing. Like first you, I don't know, get a good job and like start a company and earn your wage, and then if you've got a bit of spare capacity, you might think about like, oh, how can we integrate sustainability into what we're doing? But what the word means is the ability to continue. So if something is unsustainable, and nobody ever claims that our current society is sustainable, but equally nobody ever seems to admit that that means it's going to end, which is literally what the word means.
So are you saying, or I don't want to put words in your mouth, are you saying collapse in one way, collapse, bring it on, even though
to quote John Michael Greer, I'm saying collapse now and avoid the rush.
Yeah.
Collapse is coming in the sense that there's no way we can possibly sustain the path that we're on now. Put it this way, like either we radically change direction or we end up where we're headed. And neither of those look like today. So the future is not going to look like today. And the consequences of what's unfolding today don't bring that to a nice crash landing on a big fluffy bed of pillows and duvets. Collapse also, I think, is not something we should talk about as a future event anymore. There's the science fiction writer William Gibson said the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And there have been a lot of people taking part in our Surviving the Future courses, for example, from places that they very clearly say have collapsed. A good friend of mine who I met through the courses is from Venezuela, and she's talks about what it's like living through economic collapse, what it's like seeing all your school friends struggling to feed themselves. I tend to look at the world less as moving towards this event of collapse, and in some ways in some ways it's a reassuring thought. It's not that we're like standing on the train tracks waiting for the train of collapse to hit us. Collapse is what we're living through now. I more think of it as shrinking circles of affluence. So anyone who's still sitting around going, well, where's your apocalypse, mate? Well, they're still inside one of those shrinking circles of affluence. The majority of the world is not inside those shrinking circles of affluence. And I would also add, let's look beyond humanity when we talk about our world. The majority of the non-human world is experience human-driven collapse and has been for a very long time. All these triumphant techno-utopians who talk about, well, look at the graph of human population, which is the most terrifying graph I've ever seen. Look at the graph of human population and the exponential growth as a triumph. This shows the incredible ingenuity of our species. And you're like, well, hang on. Can we also, when we talk about world population, we invariably are talking about world human population. And if we actually plot world population and include everybody else who's on the planet, that graph doesn't look like that, because everybody else is going the other way, virtually everybody else.
So thank you. So you touched on this briefly already, but so given all of that, what nourishes you? What allows you to feel fully alive? what insights can you share with us about, how to make a story of your life that's worth telling? Like, what have you seen about that for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think to talk about that, or one way into talking about that, would be the word sacrifice, which I find a very interesting word, because the etymology of sacrifice is to make sacred. And that's really interesting to me, because we tend to think of sacrifice as this painful, awful thing, like giving something up, losing something. But for example, like I quit flying, well, it'd be 20 years ago this year, for climate reasons, not because I thought that would derail the, global emissions and save the world. But I mean, it was a very personal thing, really, that I was seeing a girl at the time from California, and one thing in the world I'd love to see more than anything else is the great redwood trees in California. I'm a little obsessed with trees, and she invited me out to sort of meet her family out there, and I just realized I felt really deeply uncomfortable with this idea, and it was particularly difficult talking about this at the time, because now people know, oh, Shaun doesn't fly, but then I'd flown plenty before that, and then suddenly I'm like, no, I don't want to go to California. But when I reflected on that, I thought, I don't feel right about going to see these great beings and knowing in myself that in so doing I've contributed to their demise. That doesn't feel like who I want to be. And so giving up that experience was actually a process of choosing to be happier. Like, I didn't want that dissonance inside me of knowing that I was acting in ways that were contributing to something I despise. That isn't how I want to be, not because I want to be like a good person or because I think it's going to save the world, but because I like being happy. And when I reflected on it, and I think there's as I've kind of reflected on that decision over the couple of decades since, I've kind of distilled it into this principle, I suppose, that I think there's a reason why so many ecologically aware folk have a reputation of being really hectoring and annoying and dull as ditch water and wouldn't know how to enjoy themselves in a vegan chocolate factory. And it's because so many of us live in this continual tension between kind of guilt and self-sacrifice. It's like, oh, I really want a bacon sandwich, but I shouldn't. Oh, but I really want one. So I'm either feeling terrible about not getting the thing I want or terrible about getting the thing I want. And God, of course that's not inspiring. Like, of course nobody looks at that and thinks, oh yeah, I want to live like that, right? But what I do instead of that is let the two parts of myself talk to each other, which seems to be something so rare in our culture. Like, the part of me that wants the thing, the jet flight, the bacon sandwich, the whatever it is, and the part of me that doesn't want the consequences of the thing. And I find that when I let those two parts of myself actually talk to each other, pretty quickly they come to an accord. And as I say, I realized not that, oh God, part of me wants to fly to California and part of me doesn't, but no, I, as an integrated person, don't want to go. And so I'm not going to go. And that's not, painful. That's actually a choice of me doing what I want to do. Yeah. And I think that process of living wholeheartedly, choosing things with your entire self is such a key to being fully alive. And it really is as simple as just taking the different parts of yourself that are in conflict and letting them converse and then kind of converge.
That's brilliant. And Diane's just said in the chat, Gollum had the right idea then, talking to himself.
Yeah, Gollum's my personal guru, actually. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, he lives under my bed now. Don't tell anyone because he's not very popular, but
That's brilliant. Okay, so we're about halfway through. I'm going to open it up now for other people to ask questions. So we're quite a small group, so just unmute yourself and come in. I can't see everybody, so just go for it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I've got a question, Shaun. First of all, thanks so much for coming and speaking to us today. It's just really inspirational, really enjoying this conversation. What for you obviously we're in this kind of shrinking tunnel of affluence now. What for you, how do you envision collapse here coming about?
Here being Hertfordshire?
Yeah, or England, or, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually in Ireland at the moment. Yeah, I'm part of a little community here around a place called the Happy Pig. Yeah, I mean, I think even within the, well, I could probably speak most of the English context because that's where I've been for most of my life. You know, even within that context, again, I think the future's already here. It's just unevenly distributed. You know, there are growing numbers of people who struggle to feed their families and heat their homes. And, you know, one of the consequences of a culture that financializes everything, that quantifies everything in terms of money, is that collapse turns into a financial issue as well. You know, the way that we decide who gets to eat is who's got the rationing coupons with the Queen's head on them. You know, who's got the money. And there's nothing inherently monetary about this crisis, but that's just how we decide to share out our resources and our decisions about who gets to do what and who has to do what. And so at this stage, I think the main thing is that, you know, we're seeing at the moment, is it like any day now, the energy prices are going to shoot up by about 50% for most people due to the way that the government it sort of manipulates isn't quite the word I'm looking for, but the way the government manages energy prices and energy companies. And, you know, that's going to get harder and harder for more and more people. And I think that's why it seems to me some of the most important work that we can do is offering different stories of what underpins that. Because I mentioned my friend from Venezuela, and she had the quite depressing experience in the last few months that she's been back home in Venezuela and talking to a lot of people there. And what she's found is that people have gone through this kind of collapse process. And all that they are talking about is how do we get back to where we were? Like, how do we get Nutella in the supermarkets again? Because the process has been one of having something involuntarily taken away from them. A bit like if I, you know, had someone come to me and say, well, you just can't fly anymore. You know, we're banning you from flying. Well, then I'd probably just be thinking, well, how do I get my flights back, right? It's very different from having gone through a process of coming to a place of realizing that actually I don't want that or the consequences of that. And I think that is the issue, is that as long as people are seeing this as a financial issue, then all that you want, very appropriately, all that you want when you don't have the money to feed your family is enough money to feed your family. I mean, that's just appropriate.
Yeah.
But it isn't actually the money that people want, it's the ability to support their family that people want. And you know, there are ways of doing that in other contexts. I mean, obviously, like, it could be growing your food, it could be having a relationship with people who grow your food, it could be basing things much more in the informal economy than the monetary economy. It could be time banking, it could be local currencies, it could be any number of alternatives that there are. But yeah, what I see, unfortunately, at the moment is a culture that's very wedded to that story. And so hardship is just going to continue spreading and intensifying. I think the government is going to continue finding it harder and harder to effectively subsidize all the people's needs. There does come a point where centralized authorities, I mean, you know, the current UK government has a very strong ideology against, you know, social welfare, and that's a separate story. But nonetheless, there does come a point as a society comes under the pressures of the destabilization of the climate and the depletion of energy resources and the pollution and the drawdown of every kind of resource, you know, the water table, the depletion of populations of all the species that we eat, etc., all the myriad of interlocking crises that we face. Obviously, there comes a point where that centralized authority might not just be unwilling to support people, but actually unable to do so, because money is ultimately a call on something real. And if that something real isn't there, then it ultimately doesn't matter how much money you print. As the Native Americans told us centuries ago, you can't eat the stuff. So yeah, unfortunately, the path that we're currently on, I see as one of just increasing hardship, with that desperation leading to greater environmental destruction, as people, you know, grab hold of whatever they can. I mean, the idea of, I mean, you're seeing it in America at the moment. You've got, on the one hand, Biden is saying we're going to ban Russian imports of oil and gas. On the other hand, the government is simultaneously boasting that they're producing more oil and gas than they ever have, you know, and that we ever did under Trump, which is of course what they particularly care about in their weird political rivalries. And so, you know, the idea there is not, let's get away from this incredibly destructive energy system that we're on, but let's just, you know, reduce our dependence on a country that we're, you know, currently seeing as the enemy. And as I say, to bring in the optimism as well as the dark, you know, to me, the most important work we can do in that context is providing spaces where people can see needs being met in other ways. So, for example, here, you know, my great friend who I mentioned before, Mark Boyle, he, several years ago, well, no, over 10 years ago, he was like, well, almost everyone I see who's doing something they don't believe in, they're doing it for money. And so he was getting quite anti-money, and someone challenged him and said, well, if you hate money so much, why don't you give it up? And he said, all right. So he decided to live without money for a year and write a book about it, which he did. It's called The Moneyless Man, and it's a fine read.
It's a great book.
And then the irony is that the book became incredibly popular and sold really well, and he got a load of money from it. And then we were like, well, what do we do with this money? And so what we did was basically buy this piece of land that I'm sitting on now, and as we see it, buy it out of slavery, like buy it out of the market economy. So we've got a place here we call the Happy Pig, where people can come and stay for free and eat for free and you know, just exist without having to sell their labor, you know, in the economy somehow, in order to have a place to be. And without going on too much, like I would say, like that for me is the fundamental challenge that we face. You know, I was involved with Extinction Rebellion from the start, and back then I used to give a lot of talks to Extinction Rebellion groups about how, I think, you know, Extinction Rebellion is probably widely seen as a climate change protest, and arguably it possibly is that now, but I used to give talks about how it's actually neither of those things really. I mean, it was never meant to be a protest, it was meant to be a rebellion. It was meant to be, we actually refuse to participate in this society anymore because you've broken the social contract and are destroying our future, and so we are beginning mass civil disobedience to refuse to be part of this ongoing extinction. And it was never per se about climate change, it was about extinction. And a lot of people take that as meaning human extinction. I don't limit myself to human extinction. To me, it's about the absolutely unfolding extinction, sixth mass extinction in the history of our planet that's happening right now. You know, over 100 species a day going extinct now. And climate change is about third or fourth on the list of causes. You know, habitat destruction, pollution are far bigger causes of today's extinctions. I mean, climate change, don't get me, you know, I was a climate activist for many, many years. I mean, climate change is absolutely huge and is going to get worse and like the time we should have dealt with it was some time ago, in fact. But what's interesting about that is if climate change isn't the main driver now, but the extinction is already happening, then what is the cause? And again, this brings us back to like why just switching to renewables isn't going to solve the issue. To my mind, the cause ultimately is our cultural stories about what's important and how we relate to each other and to the more than human world. And when I drill down into that, the story that I see most dominant in our culture now is financial independence. The idea that your first duty as a citizen, as a consumer, is to support yourself financially. Otherwise, you're a sponger, or you're a parasite, or you're a benefit scrounger, or whatever, right? That's your first duty. Then if you've done that and you want to then go out and campaign about something or whatever, fine, then you've earned your right to have your own time. That, I think, is so pernicious, so deep. Like, it's such a deep story that, if you don't feel like you're financially independent, you may be embarrassed to admit it to your family members or to your friends. You maybe try and hide it by secretly taking out a loan or whatever you do, right? It's so deep in us that we don't even question it.
Yeah, it's like a personal failure. Yeah.
Right, and yeah, I would argue, because even the richest people.
Frozen.
Did I lose me for a moment? No? Am I back?
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
I seem to be moving again. Yeah. So yeah, I would argue that despite, as you said, Kim, this being such a deeply embedded thing that we see it as a personal failure if we don't live up to it, financial independence doesn't even exist. Like, even the richest people, billionaires, they're not independent. Like, someone else still grows their food, someone else still built their house, someone else still does all the things that they need to be done. All that money allows you to do is be dependent on people you don't know instead of being dependent on people you do know, which is actually miserable. It's actually no fun at all, because you'd have no meaningful relationships anymore. And like, everyone you meet is just out, or you're worried that they're just out for your money. I read a book by an incredibly rich guy who was talking about nobody had touched him, physically touched him in years, because you don't touch rich people. You pull their chair out for them very carefully, and you just know you haven't touched another human being in years. And this miserable state of existence is what we're all devoting almost all of our time to working towards before we can think about anything else. Otherwise, it's a personal failure. I mean, this is so mad. And so I would say that that is the fundamental level at which it makes sense to work for change, to talk to people about, to think about, to build examples of, as we're trying to do here. And indeed, as John said in the chat there about self-sufficiency, I think self-sufficiency is very often the green version of financial independence. It's the illusion of being able to meet all your needs yourself rather than being interdependent with others, which is always the reality. And yeah, again, not just with human beings, but with the whole natural world. So sorry, I've gone on quite a lot in response to your question, Kate, really, but there was a lot to say.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate. Who else? Just got about 15 minutes left. Just come in if you've got a question.
I haven't got a question. I just want to say that you have just really given me a lovely sort of shift, Shaun, with this idea that instead of feeling that the world is collapsing around you and taking things away from you, you can make your own decision not to want them anymore. I also don't fly, and the powerful feeling it gave me to be able to say, yes, I could, but I'm not going to anymore. And I'm not going to eat, I don't know, Marmite, and I'm not going to, just the self-empowerment of being able to say no before it's taken away from me, I think is big for me. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you, Jane.
And I think as well, like, it's at least hypothetically possible that when something's involuntarily taken away from you, that you could retrospectively decide, maybe that was good for me. but I think that's an awful lot harder. I mean, that's a skill that a lot of people are having to try and learn because they don't have the privilege that we have. But I also think it's something I really challenge myself on at the moment is, since I believe that times will continue to get harder for most of us, I have in myself both the impulse of, you know, well, I'd like myself and my close people to, you know, not have to go through the worst of that, and the impulse to try and widen the circle of my compassion beyond that. And I think often those are compatible, like often the things that we do to support our nearest and dearest are also to the benefit of the wider world, but not always. And we all know plenty of examples of people, you know, looking after their own to the exclusion of others. And I don't have a neat answer to that, but I do think it's really important to acknowledge those impulses in ourselves, and confront them where appropriate in ourselves, if only so that we can empathize with others. Because to me, the deepest challenge that we face today is a crisis in ways of relating. And there's such a drive in our cultures at the moment to polarization, to the idea that on any issue, what you do is you figure out who's on this side and who's on that side, whether it's, I don't know, climate deniers and believers, or you know, pro-vax and anti-vax, or right and left, or whatever it is. And to me, the fundamental issue here is, can we not talk to each other about things we disagree about? Like, has that ceased to be a thing that we do anymore? Like, I mean, like the COVID thing, I am perfectly capable of understanding both why during a lethal pandemic people might want to get vaccinated. I'm also completely capable of understanding why people might have no trust in big pharma. I'm also completely capable of understanding why people might be worried about the medical effects of vaccination. I'm also completely capable of understanding why people might be worried about the civil liberties implications of shutting down society. I don't feel any need to take a side in this. I can sit and talk with people about these conflicting desires that we all share and how we're going to balance those. That doesn't have to be a tribal thing.
No, absolutely. So
just Kim,
sorry,
just to finish that thought. So, you know, when I recognize in myself this impulse to, you know, look after my own, I don't indulge that impulse, but I do use it to help me understand those who are like, let's keep out the refugees, for example. Like, and I don't want to turn them into another tribe either. I don't want to turn them into them. You know, I want to be like, okay, there's a person who shares this same impulse that I share. And I think the way that they're responding to that isn't actually to the benefit of us all. So we can talk about that, but not see them as an enemy.
Yeah, thank you. Brilliant. Diane, I think you had a question, and then we'll come to John.
Yeah, I think it wasn't so much a question. It was more a follow on from what Jane said about flying. I gave up flying a few years ago as well. And the trouble is, you need money in order not to fly if you want to travel. I booked a holiday to Orkney about 3 years ago, before the pandemic. It's been rolled over, and finally I'm going to go in May. And I thought, I'm not going to go, I'm not going to fly at any point. So trains, boats, you know, etc. Mainly trains and boats. But it's going to take me 2 days of travelling and costing me about 500 quid in actually traveling, whereas if I flew, it would be half the price, or less than half the price. So my point is really that in order to not fly and still travel anywhere at all, you have to have money, which, unless you're going to walk, do you know what I mean? So I think we've got to work we also need to work on reducing the cost of public transport, for instance, so that trains are actually cheaper than flying, in order for most people to be able to do that. But at the moment, it's only people who are reasonably comfortably off who are able to do that.
Yeah,
thank you,
I mean,
Diana.
I think that's absolutely right. We clearly have an omnicidal economy that's driving everybody to destructive choices, and I think it's incredibly important work to try and challenge that. One of the large scale solutions, one of the large scale frameworks we need is a system that supports more healthy choices, and not just healthy for ourselves, but for our wider environment. Equally, given that we are where we are, and that is the society that we live in, we have a personal choice still that, well, given that is the economy that I live in, do I choose to travel in those ways? Do I is that, and again, I would emphasize letting the part of you that does want to travel and the part of you that doesn't want the consequence of that to talk to each other and find a decision you make with your whole heart. And I don't say that assuming what the answer will be. I would hate to think that someone took a jet flight and then didn't enjoy it because they were feeling guilty. To destroy the world for the sake of something that you don't even let yourself enjoy seems even more mad to me than doing it and actually taking pleasure in it. So really, choose a wholehearted path. And also, as a final word on that, I would recommend Mark Boyle's second book, The Moneyless Manifesto, which talks about ways to reduce your money dependence on money. It talks about ways to travel for free, whether that be hitchhiking, whether that be couch surfing, whether that be staying with friends, whether that be a thing called house swap, where you and someone abroad each go and stay in each other's homes while you're away. There are plenty of less monetary dependent ways of experiencing wonder, and of course, discovering things closer to ourselves. There's a line in Lean Logic talking about transport, which he quotes: "The unanswerable question at the heart of transport, the one asked by the farm labourer standing bemused one day in the mid-18th century at the side of the Liverpool-Manchester turnpike, crowded with urgently speeded coaches. He asked himself, who would ever have thought that there were so many people in the wrong place?"
Oh, beautiful. Thank you. John, you've had your hand up for a long time. Go for it. Thank you. John, yeah. Great.
Yes, and I'm taking down my hand, otherwise I'll forget. I just wanted to get in there before the end and thank Shaun and yourself for the questions, because it's so inspiring to come across someone thinking so radically about things in proper depth, and the things that I'm perhaps only wondering about, and there you are, having thought them through. So I've really enjoyed the session. I wanted to raise the idea of burnout, that actually to knock your head against a brick wall beyond the resources you've got is actually setting a very bad example, instead of finding things you can do, and perhaps to sustain you in acting upon them, to find some form of consolation or a viewpoint or something that gives you comfort. And that can be friends and family, underestimated before, possibly, where you thought the purpose was to do the things that you raised at the beginning, Shaun. And consolations could consist of belief systems, could be a scientific discipline. In my case, it's the idea of deep ecology, in which, well, a species come and go, and here's an unsustainable one. Won't last long, but on we go through space. But that's not necessarily one I'd recommend to anybody else. It's a bit detached from everyday things, but it gives me consolation anyway. I just wondered if you wanted to comment, Shaun, on consolations.
Yeah, sure. Maybe that's a good one to end on, Kim.
Yeah, by all means.
So yeah, burnout, I've very much been there. 7 or 8 years ago, I really drove myself into the ground. And I think, well, I think first I'd agree with both sides of what you said, John, that there can be real consolation in, taking a very big step back and looking at things. And I mean, ultimately, I mean, the universe, right? It either came from nothing and is going back to nothing, or it always is and always will be and always has been. So either way, how much can we mess it up, really? You know, like if we end everything, maybe it'll just start from nothing again, or, you know. So like in the very biggest picture, on the kind of, you know, cosmology or spiritual level, yes, I find some consolation there, but I think that always has to be tempered, as you say, with the fact that it is quite detached, and that it's all very well going, well, maybe humanity's going to die, and it's totally different from, you know, your sister being suffering and being on the point of death, and you do absolutely anything in the world to make her be okay, and you can't, because society's collapsing around you. It's very different from the participant on our course right now whose daughter-in-law is in Kyiv. You know, so I think it's really important to hold both sides of this, the danger in detachment, but also, yeah, the succor that it can bring. But yeah, in terms of, you know, and again, you know, all the great atrocities in history have come through quite a detached point of view of, you know, oh, well, you know, you've got to break a few eggs, haven't you? But yeah, in terms of burnout, I mean, and this kind of gets to the heart of dark optimism as well. Like, one of the things that always frustrates me a lot in environmental conversations is there's one argument that you hear over and over and over again, which is, on the one hand, you'll have someone saying, we can't wait for paradigm change. We can't wait for anything radical. Everything's far too urgent. We have to operate within the frameworks we've got now. And I'm sure we've all heard that argument in so many different contexts. And then on the other hand, you'll have someone saying, but what's the point? If we don't have radical fundamental change, we're just addressing the symptoms. We're not addressing the fundamental problem. Like, we absolutely need fundamental change. And the funny thing about the argument is that I listen to both of those points of view and I agree with both of them. And I very rarely hear anyone acknowledge that. There's just this constant back and forth between these two perspectives, fighting. And the really interesting question for me is, what if we admitted that, yes, we need absolutely fundamental radical change, and yes, there isn't time for that? Because that's where we are. So can we talk about where we are? And for me, when I went into a deep burnout, having bashed my head against that wall of impossibility for quite a while, I went on this retreat with a group called Eco Dharma, and one of the many incredible exercises we did there was sitting, two of us opposite each other, two burned out activists opposite each other, and one would just ask the question, if nothing I can do is ever enough, then what can I do? And then the other of us would say something about that in response to that. And then the first partner would just repeat the question, maybe with a slightly different emphasis, maybe not. Just, okay, if nothing you can do is ever enough, then what can you do? And somehow our second answer to that was a little bit deeper. And we just repeated this to each other and went deeper and deeper into this question. And I found that incredibly powerful. And what I found in response to that question, you know, what if we need radical change and there isn't time for radical change? Firstly, I found deep grief. I found pain and tears, and like having to accept that there are things in this world that, if I could, as Robinson Jeffers put it, if I could burn my hand in a slow fire to change the future, then I would, but I can't. But then, on the far side of grief, and I don't know any way to honor how deep and painful and long that grief was in a conversation, but on the far side of all of that, I found that grief kind of takes all of you, and it's non-negotiable and it's overwhelming. But if you, instead of denying it, sit with it and go into it and let it break you, there comes a day when it only takes 99% of you. And you're kind of like, no, take all of me, but it doesn't. It's just as non-negotiable when it only takes 99% of you. And then you have to decide what to do with the 1% of you that isn't grieving. And in that space, for me, it was like, okay, actually, I believe I live in a dying world, and I don't believe I can change that. okay, here I am in a dying world. I'm still here. What am I going to do with my days? And then maybe I choose to try and preserve habitats to keep dying species alive a little longer, to create spaces of beauty and love, to bear witness to the truth in whatever ways I can, to challenge the injustices that I see. But then it's coming from such a different motivation, what my friend Michael Dowd calls the post-doom motivation, because then there's no fear of burnout anymore, because then all I'm doing each day is telling the story I want to tell with my days. And I think burnout comes from the denial of like, oh God, I can't look at the latest data because it's just going to make me lose all hope. And that's exhausting because you're denying something that you yourself know to be true. It's exhausting. But when we go beyond that to the place where like, okay, actually, yeah, all the data just confirms what I've accepted in myself. But nonetheless, this is who I want to be in this context. That's not exhausting. That's beautiful. That's a joy to live each day in the way that you believe in the context of the truth as best you understand it. And yeah, that's dark optimism. That's this post-doom perspective. And that's why I think it's not only the antidote to burnout, and it's certainly not the solution to all the problems of sustainability, because ultimately sustainability is not a thing anything achieves. All things end, all things move towards their end, even the universe, all things move towards their end. So sustainability is always an impossibility ultimately. So let's not wed the meaning of our lives to sustainability. Let's not count the number of our days, but the amount of life that we put into our days. And, you know, all of us as individuals are going to die. You know, we're all moving towards our end. But we've got time, we've got hopefully years here together to do beautiful things with our time, and that's all anyone's ever had. And yeah, thank you all for being brave and honest enough to be part of conversations like this about finding our way to that place.
Wow, Shaun, we've gone a few minutes over. Thank you so much. It was extraordinary. I knew it would be, but it's still wonderful that it was. Thank you so much. We'll post the recording on our various channels, and if we all want to unmute ourselves and say au revoir to Shaun, but thank you. Beautiful.
Yeah, very profound, Shaun.
Privilege, Shaun.
Yeah, real
Thank you so
privilege.
much.
Real privilege. Thank you.
I mean, that last thing I said, it was in some way paraphrasing a blog post I wrote about 10 years ago, which I've put in the chat as well if people are interested. Yeah, it's good to be walking this path with you all. And joy is a good guide as to whether we're on the right one.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shaun.
Thanks, Shaun. Yeah.
Thanks, Kimberley.
See you soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks, Kimberley, for letting me in, for giving me the Zoom. Don't know why. I'm always accessing these things. I don't know why.
Wonderful conversation.
Goodbye, everybody.